Well, howdy, partners. Welcome to the Region 4 Rodeo right here in sunny side Washington. I'm Dan Payne. I'm the Regional Transportation Coordinator, and I work with school districts in ESD 105, 123, and 171. I'm here to welcome you to the 2024-2025 in-service. So we started out silly, but we are going to talk about some things that are serious. We're going to talk about three things during this segment of in-service. We're going to talk about the legalization of marijuana in Washington State and how that affects you as a commercial school bus driver. We're also going to talk about CBD usage and whether or not that's a good idea. We'll spend some time covering the federal DOT drug and alcohol testing regulations and the requirements that surround that. And finally, we're going to talk about what if. What are the consequences if you have a drug or alcohol violation? So if you're ready to start this, I'm ready to start this, and let's get going. So if you're going to drive one of these, you have to have a commercial driver's license. Remember that a commercial driver's license, or a CDL, is a federal license. It's regulated by both the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration as well as the Washington State Department of Licensing. Why am I telling you that? You probably already know it, but it's a great segue into the first topic that we're going to discuss, and that's marijuana, weed, pot, Mary Jane. You get the idea. Those are all the things we're going to be talking about. Under federal regulations, specifically 49 CFR 40.82, drug testing is a 5-panel test looking for 5 different substances: marijuana metabolites, or delta-9 THC, cocaine metabolites, amphetamines, opioids, and phencyclidine, or PCP. The delta-9 THC metabolite are the remnants of the psychoactive cannabis and remains in your system long after the psychoactive cannabis has left your system. While the use of products with a THC concentration of less than 0.3% is not prohibited, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and OSPI continue to recommend that CDL holders subject to drug testing avoid the use of CBD products, even if the label states they are THC-free or less than 0.3% THC. These products are not regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. Claims on the labels are not verified and could result in a positive drug test. Although many states have legalized the use of recreational marijuana, remember that marijuana remains a prohibited substance under federal law, so it will create a positive drug test result. You may have heard that Washington recently passed a new law limiting the ability for employers to use drug test results that show non-psychoactive cannabis in your drug test. Keep in mind that that law does not apply to commercial drivers or CDL holders, and we're talking today specifically about school bus drivers. So now we're going to move on and talk about federal drug and alcohol testing under DOT rules. The federal regulation that applies to CDL drug and alcohol testing is 49 CFR 382. This is great reading, so if you've got spare time, you should Google it. For our presentation today, we're just going to define some acronyms. We'll start with the MRO, or the Medical Review Officer. This is a licensed medical practitioner who oversees the testing and analysis process. They also verify all test results, and they sign reports that go back to the employers. The next one is the DER, or the Designated Employer Representative. This is the person in your school district, and it's usually your supervisor, who communicates with the MRO and other drug testing service providers. They're also the person who receives the quarterly random testing list. This is the person who has the authority to remove a driver from performing a safety-sensitive function if they have any suspicion that the driver is under the influence. Next, let's talk about the tests that are required under federal DOT drug and alcohol testing regulations. The first one obviously, is the pre-employment drug test. Pre-employment drug test must be conducted before the driver performs a safety-sensitive function for the employer. Important to note that a safety-sensitive function includes driving a commercial vehicle on the public roadway, even for training. So a pre-employment drug test must be completed after the trainee obtains their commercial learner's permit, but before they drive on the public roadway for training. The next type of testing is post-accident testing, and the first test under post-accident is a test for alcohol. As soon as practicable after a qualifying accident, and a qualifying accident means that there was a fatality in any vehicle, or the commercial driver received a citation from law enforcement within 8 hours of the accident, and there were injuries from the accident that were treated away from the scene, or any vehicle in the accident was required to be towed from the scene. Alcohol testing must be conducted within 8 hours of the accident. If it is not conducted, the employer must stop trying to test and then document why that alcohol testing didn't happen. The second type of post-accident testing is drugs. As soon as practicable after a qualifying accident, which a qualifying accident means that there was a fatality, or that the commercial driver received a citation from law enforcement within 32 hours and there were injuries treated away from the scene, or any vehicle had to be towed from the scene. Drug testing must be conducted within 32 hours of the accident. If drug testing isn't conducted within that time frame, the employer must stop trying to test and document why that testing didn't happen. A couple of final notes about post-accident testing. Drivers that are subject to post-accident tests should not use alcohol until they are tested or after 8 hours after the accident. This seems like common sense, but it's very important to remember that. The second note is that drivers that are subject to post-accident testing must remain available for that testing. All of you have had a pre-employment drug test before you started. Hopefully not too many of you have had to do a post-accident drug test. Now we're going to talk about two other drug tests that affect all commercial drivers. One of those is a random drug test, and I know many of you have experience with that. And another one is a reasonable suspicion drug test. Random drug and alcohol testing happens starting with a random list that is sent to the DER around the beginning of each calendar quarter. 50% of the total number of drivers are picked for drug testing on an annual basis. 10% of the total number of drivers are picked for alcohol testing in a given year. This doesn't mean that 50% of the actual drivers are tested. It means that there needs to be a quantity of tests in relation to total drivers meeting the 50% or the 10% threshold. So yes, it's very possible that you could be picked for either drug or alcohol testing more than once per year. Picks are made on a mathematically random basis. A couple of notes about random testing. Tests must be unannounced, and when notified, the driver must proceed immediately to the test site. The only exception to that is if the driver is actively performing a safety-sensitive function, then they must finish that function and then proceed ASAP to the test site. The last type of testing we'll talk about is reasonable suspicion testing. And that's a case where the employer has an observed reason to believe that the driver is under the influence of alcohol or drugs. District DERs should reach out to testing consortium providers for reasonable suspicion training, which is required by law, as well as training on the understanding of DER responsibilities. So, what is a positive drug test? A positive drug test is when you test positive for any of the 5 substances that we talked about earlier on a DOT 5-panel drug test. A positive alcohol test is a blood alcohol concentration of 0.04 or higher. Keep in mind that 0.4 is considerably lower than the 0.08 concentration for a driving under the influence ticket. We just talked about all of the testing required under DOT drug and alcohol regulations, but what if a driver decides they don't want to participate? They don't want to be part of drug and alcohol testing. What happens then? First, you need to know that a refusal to test is reported to the Department of Licensing and to your employer as a positive drug test. A refusal to test has some very specific definitions and some specific consequences. It could include things like failing to go to the collection site when you're directed to do so. You're required to go as soon as you're directed to get your drug test. Other things like failing to cooperate with any part of the testing process, failing to provide enough specimen for testing when there's no medically valid reason for your inability to provide that specimen. Another example of a refusal is adulterating a sample or substituting a sample, like someone else's urine for a drug test because you are concerned you might fail. Those are all examples of refusals. In your handout, you will have a full list of all of the things that are considered a refusal under the federal regulations. Another common question that comes up is, what if I'm taking a prescription medication? Will that cause me to fail a drug test? In general, the answer is no. As long as you have a valid prescription from your doctor and that prescription can be verified by the medical review officer, that will be reported to your employer as a negative drug test. Remember also that under the regulations, your employer has the ability to require employees, commercial drivers, to report to them any therapeutic drug use. So if you're on any regular prescriptions from your doctor, your employer can require you to report that to the employer and also ask that you provide doctor's verification that those medications won't affect your ability to safely operate a commercial vehicle. So now we're going to move on to the last segment, and we're going to talk about the consequences. What happens if? What happens if you do get a positive drug test? If you have a reported positive test, the dominoes will start to fall. You're authorized to drive a school bus under rules from two different agencies. The Department of Licensing and FMCSA regulate your commercial driver's license. OSPI, on the other hand, regulates your school bus driver's authorization. A positive test will trigger consequences with each agency. First, the Department of Licensing will disqualify your CDL. If you wish to reinstate your CDL, you'll be required to contact a substance abuse professional for an evaluation and comply with all of their requirements for assessment, education, and any additional testing. OSPI will revoke your school bus driver's authorization. A positive DOT drug test is a 5-year disqualification under OSPI rules. All of the disqualifying conditions can be found in WAC 392-144-103. It's important to remember that these two agencies have different sets of rules. You may have the ability to reinstate your CDL after a positive drug test by following all of DOL's criteria. This will allow you to return to driving a commercial vehicle. However, you will be disqualified from operating a public school bus under OSPI rules for 5 years. So we've covered a lot of information here at the rodeo today in a relatively short amount of time. So let's take a few minutes and summarize and reflect on what we've talked about. First, even though recreational marijuana is legal in the state of Washington, remember that your license, your commercial driver's license, is a federal license, and marijuana is still illegal at the federal level and will result in a positive drug test. Also keep in mind that CBD products are not regulated by the FDA. OSPI and FMCSA both discourage the use of CBD products by commercial drivers because the claims on those labels are not verified. The use of a CBD product could result in a positive drug test. We talked about the 4 different types of drug tests that you're subject to as a commercial driver, and we also talked about what constitutes a refusal, and that a refusal to test is reported to your employer and DOL as a positive test. Finally, we covered the consequences. What happens if you do have a positive drug test? Your ability to reinstate your CDL with the Department of Licensing, and your inability to drive a public school bus with a school bus driver's authorization for 5 years as a result of that positive test. Thanks for joining me today here at the Region 4 Rodeo. Glad that you made it. I really hope that you have an excellent 24-25 school year, and we truly appreciate everything that each of you does for kids every day. Thanks.